Hey.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Grey, and this is Grey Matter.
Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to another X live stream with Grey Matter. Many of you in our American audience are celebrating still your Thanksgiving holiday. As you can see in my home, we're well into Christmas. Behind me in the background is my wife's prize-winning Grinch Christmas tree. It's become a family tradition, and the ornamentation on it is growing annually, much like our national debt. Speaking of Canada, we have a couple of great guests on today, and we were going to talk about things like, South Korea declaring martial law because of communism. We were going to talk about the ongoing wars in Gaza and, of course, Ukraine, and we are going to get to those. But there's one story that has really usurped all of those. It's certainly in the minds of Canadians and also in the minds of many Americans, which is really strange for those of us who reside in Canada. And that is the concept of Canada becoming the 51st state. And for that matter, why all the attention on Canada? Well, before we introduce our guests, by way of background, there's a little bit of history here that's worth noting. Back in February of 2022, Donald Trump gave a very stirring speech at CPAC, during which he essentially called Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, an authoritarian. And he made a promise if he became president again, he was going to essentially free Canada from all of this. Well, flash forward to about a year ago, a story in the National Post reads, Trump is more popular among Canadians than Trudeau. Well, and that doesn't mean much. I think COVID is more popular than Trudeau in Canada right now, but it's still significant that made our national news. And but even more important is as Trump begins to name members of his new cabinet, people like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, the new border czar, Mr. Homan, Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., they're all talking about Canada, and Canada being a geopolitical threat to the United States. And one of our guests, Brandon Weichert of the Weichert Report, esteemed author, he's been actually writing and talking about this for several years. In fact, he was on a show on the BBC way back in 2017 talking about this. And he is a very well-respected and renowned geopolitical analyst. He's written several books. The most recent one we're going to talk about is on the Ukraine situation, called A Disaster of Our Own Making. So we've got one American big brain on here, and to sort of balance out the scales, we also have Drew Allen on, who's written a really fascinating book called America's Last Stand, which was about really the challenge to America of the most recent election, which we all know turned out very well for the Republicans, and maybe, just maybe, for Canada. So guys, welcome to the live stream. It's great to have you on here. Thanks for taking the time to be with us and for our viewers and listeners.
Thanks for having me.
So Brandon, let's start off with you. We'll start here. Yesterday, Donald Trump basically breaks social media. He tweets out this meme on his own social media platform, Truth Social, which nobody else besides him seems to pay a lot of attention to. But he's standing on a mountaintop people have probably seen this, next to a Canadian flag. And it looks like he's staring out at Mount Schmatterhorn. But the idea is, and he says, "Oh, Canada." Now, people in Canada are freaking out about this. Some are welcoming it. They're saying, looking at Trump, maybe the way Austrians thought about Hitler in 1938, bring on the Anschluss. What do you think Trump intended?
That's a loaded comparison.
I want to start this up. I said some Canadians, right? I mean, there's no question. Some Austrians thought of Hitler as a liberator at the time.
Well,
right?
I will tell you, I think we were talking about this before the show started. I think Saskatchewan and certainly Alberta would welcome us as liberators, not to sound like Dick Cheney in Iraq.
Absolutely.
But I think that we would be welcomed in certain important parts of Canada that are often overlooked and suppressed by the regime in Ottawa. And people keep saying the 51st state. I keep saying, oh, no, no, no. Why would we want to make that one big state? We want to
Mhm.
actually follow the provinces. It's 10 provinces and 3
Yep.
territories. So 63 stars to the flag, or 60 stars to the flag, plus 3 new territories. And that's great. But no, I think, jokes aside, there is an argument, and there has been an argument since 1776
Right.
for the Americans to absorb at least a large portion of Canada. It is, I think, probably 60 to 70% a joke, but there is a real concern here. And if I can just get like a minute to kind of break into
Sure. Yeah.
why
Please
we are
do.
worried about Canada. So the first thing is, and this is what I was on the BBC to talk about in 2017, and they never had me back on because I humiliated Dan Damon and the others that were on the show with me. Basically, the regime in Ottawa continues to import people from the Middle East and North Africa, generally who are of the Islamic faith, and many of whom are unvetted or improperly vetted refugees coming into Canada. And it turns out many of them either are or were members of things like, I don't know, ISIS or Al Qaeda or Al Nusra or Al Shabaab, Islamist terrorist organizations at war, not only with the West in general, but the United States. They come into places like Toronto, they come into places like Montreal, and they basically do whatever they want. And there's a large and massive, relatively undefended land border between the United States and Canada. And the individuals seeking to engage in terrorism could very easily migrate illegally from Canada into the United States to conduct these kind of ISIS type attacks. So that's one threat. And the Canadians are not going to stop. Trudeau will not stop importing these people. They're not going to stop doing it. And so that's a threat in and of itself to the United States. The second point is natural resources.
Yeah.
Canada is sitting on a treasure trove of natural resources, which, as the people in Alberta can attest to, are often overregulated, relatively untapped, because the government is overregulating and they're overtaxing what they do pull out of the ground. So there's a lot of resentment there, and there's a lot of problems where we could be flowing with natural gas and oil and other resources throughout the North American continent, but it's being cut off by an overzealous government, which in the grand competition for dominance in the world, that is a problem, because Russia doesn't have these issues with pulling stuff out of the ground. And then lastly, of course, the Arctic. The Arctic is the back door to the United States, and it is relatively undefended. And if there is one part in the world where the Russians really are a threat directly to the United States, it's not the Middle East, it's not Europe even. It's the Arctic, and the Canadians are not doing their job of actually securing that area. Lastly, there is an ongoing territorial dispute over the so-called Northwest Passage area between us and Canada. And frankly, we can end that dispute if we just absorb Canada into the United States.
Well, that's a lot of information, but it's wonderful. Firstly, the one thing we can be sure of is if America invades, America won't need to worry about the British like in 1812.
Right.
This will be over very quickly. You don't have to worry about the White House burning down. But a couple of other threads that you brought in there, Brandon, I just want to sort of bounce these over to Drew. This may not have made your news in the United States, but Canada just committed another $50 million to Palestine. So essentially, that's going to Hamas. And secondly, Justin Trudeau, our resident idiot prime minister, essentially threatened to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu if he set foot on Canadian soil. And that's very much against, the Trump administration's position. So, Drew, Canada, Robin Williams made a very funny joke. He described Canada as a loft party or a loft apartment over a great party. So sort of picking up on what Brandon said, why do you think there's so much interest in the United States about little old Canada, a little country of 40 million people sitting on huge deposits of uranium and gold and everything else, as Brandon says? What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I'm going to go off on a brief tangent and bring it back. We kind of live in this naive space where we forget history today. And so even when it relates to Ukraine and Russia and the conflict about the eastern part of that country and the territorial disputes, a third of the United States we have because we beat the Mexicans in the Mexican-American War in 1846, 1847. And so, we got Texas and California, Nevada, and on from that. And that wasn't that long ago. But my point is in saying that is, this is human nature. This is what's going on, and our country exists as it does in its current shape because of that war and a treaty that we signed with Mexico at the time. So when you talk about Canada, though, I think we do. Despite some of the left-wing talking points about the U.S. being imperialistic and so on and so forth, the U.S. has never been imperialistic. But the role of our government and any country's government, for that matter, is to look out for its own citizens. And what we've seen under a Democrat Party and left-wing leadership that truthfully hates the United States of America. If you hate something and you don't like something, or you think that the country's inherently racist or whatever else, I mean, what kind of diplomacy are you going to engage in? If you don't like the country that you represent to begin with, so you're a weak person that gets taken advantage of. So come forward to Trump, right? And what we're talking about in this discussion now, and his message resonates with the American people. He represents what an American leader should. Democrat leaders, frankly, should have represented the same thing, that you should be proud of the country. You should be representing proudly America and its citizens. And that hasn't happened. So Trump's come in here and he's looking around the world and he's taking note. Wait a minute. The United States of America is the undisputed king of the world. And I don't mean in a monarchical sense, obviously, but we have unparalleled success and power and so on and so forth. So when it comes to Canada or our neighbors on the south, this is one continent, and that territory above us and below us, if those countries that are, of course, independently run apart from the United States of America, if they're going to engage in activities or behaviors that are going to be a threat to the United States of America, it's actually our government's role to intervene and get involved. That's what they should be doing. So when Trudeau comes down there to kiss the ring, and I mean, I loved it, by the way, because frankly,
he was summoned.
He was summoned and he came down and he got put in his place. This has nothing to do with Canadians.
His place was not Mar-a-Lago, though. Yeah, there's 162 rooms. He had to stay at the travel lodge. That's kind of funny.
Yes, yeah, with Jay Leno, but I didn't see him rolling down a hill or something, and emerge with bruises on his face. So that's a good thing. His security detail was around.
Yeah,
But I mean, Brandon basically gave, I think, a PhD summary of kind of the issues that we face and confront. But the idea that Canada, for example, would allow people to come through its border just similar to Mexico, and bring drugs and harm and into the United States of America right away. I mean, the moment that happens for the first time, especially being the United States of America with the power that we wield. I just saw this finish with that conversation they had at the dinner table at Mar-a-Lago. I mean, when Justin Trudeau comes in there, I mean, think about what a pathetic little weasel he is anyway, and he's not a statesman and he's stupid. I mean, this is a guy. He's a typical leftist, right? He has no experience, no credibility. He should not be in that position. He goes to meet with the most powerful man in the world, Donald Trump. And right off the bat with negotiations, what does he say? Hey, if you do these tariffs on us, it's going to destroy our entire economy and we're not going to exist anymore effectively. I mean, what leverage does Justin Trudeau have when you lead a discussion with that? Hey, so, okay, well, if that happens, you can become the governor of Canada, you can become the 51st state. As an American, I love it. Because I'm proud of this country and I want to see our country succeed, not at other nations' expenses, but we should be talking to people that are taking advantage of us and implementing policies that are a direct threat and harm to our life and security and prosperity. They should be treated this way. And strong leadership requires people who are willing to take action like that. That is going to be a detriment to the other party.
Sorry, Brandon, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
People are asking in the chat what this meme, why is Trump trolling Canada? I'm going to attempt to answer this, and then I'll bounce it over to Brandon and see what he thinks. I I had I had really the privilege on a fluke. A week before the election in your country, I was in a place called Henderson, Nevada, and I attended a Trump rally. And I didn't really understand MAGA until I was there and I experienced it. And I think what that meme means, this is my take on it. Interested to see what you guys think. I think that MAGA is a made in America cultural movement that is a global response to globalism. It's
Yes.
a vision for world hegemony. And it's made in America, but it's not unique to America. We see responses to it already throughout the world. And so it's quite natural that in the country that's closest to the sort of the source of the radiation, that we would see this. And I think this is what Donald Trump, what the meme means. I think what Donald Trump is saying, kind of tying into what Drew said, is that this little communism experiment in Canada that's been going on for the past 9 years is kind of over. Donald Trump is saying we're going to take a lot more sincere interest in the domestic politics of Canada because of its connection to China, because it is oppositional to MAGA, to that world vision of world hegemony. And so we're going to take a lot closer look at what's going on domestically in Canada, much more so than before. And I think that's part of the reason why Trudeau was summoned down there. He was kind of told, look, listen, the party's over. Things are going to change. What do you think about that, Brandon?
No, I think you're right. And you actually brought up the point that I meant to bring up in my opening, which is the other threat to from Canada, which is the Chinese connection.
Right.
Canada has become,
you've written about a lot.
I have. Canada has become a supplicant of Xi Jinping's new global empire. The Chinese mafia, which is an arm of China's intelligence services abroad in many cases, Chinese mafia is all over Canada running. You talk about the fentanyl trade, Drew. The fentanyl trade is co-opted in Canada, not by cartels in Mexico. It's the Chinese mafia that's running it and overseeing it. And there is a coordinated and concerted effort to flood our country in a reverse opium war situation where they're basically killing thousands of us every year, tens of thousands, to try to weaken our ability to be a great nation relative to China. And that Canada is a key conduit for those drugs. They're a key conduit, by the way, illicit arms. This is not known very well. Illicit arms are actually flowing from Canada, from overseas into Canada, into the arms of criminals here in the United States. There's this weird connection between Canada, the Chinese mafia, and undermining our safety and security here in the United States. And Trudeau, not only is he not stopping it, he's encouraging it. And then there's also the issue of the Five Eyes intelligence network.
Right.
The Five Eyes intelligence network is probably the most important intelligence program the U.S. has founded. It is a Cold War era, holdover, and Canada is one of the Five Eyes. And Canada, like New Zealand, has basically become ensconced in China, and that means that our intelligence capabilities are threatened because we share everything with Canada. Well, who are they sharing that information with if they've opened up to China? So there's real national security issues, and Leighton, you're completely correct on the cultural phenomenon, and Canada is the closest English-speaking nation to the United States, and they better get in line. Trudeau better get in line because I'm not saying we're going to invade, but Canada is ripe for the picking in many cases.
Well, it's a brutal irony for Justin Trudeau that he wanted Canada to become a post-nation state, and he succeeded.
He
succeeded. Course, like it's like all evil villains, they set out to do one thing, it's like Faustian irony, right? But Drew, you talk about in your book, in America's Last Stand, about some of the dangers that would be there for America and the world if Donald Trump did not regain the presidency. Now that he has, what do you think the implications are going to be for say the Ukraine? Well, obviously we want to talk to Brandon about his book, but the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. And again, the Canadian position, as Brandon points out, just basically mimics China's and the globalist position. But America's position is very different. They want to end these wars over there. Do you foresee that happening?
Yeah, I think it'll happen rather quickly. I mean, he's already making, he's gotten close in a lot of places. You've seen him put out warnings to the Middle East. Hey, basically, I'm going to kill you, mother effers. There will be nowhere for you to run and hide. That's what he's saying. You're going to die
Yeah.
if you don't release these hostages and so on and so forth. Your life's going to, and he's somebody who means it and will do it. Iran, a similar situation. So, this is somebody who understands the broader view and the broader problems that we face. And so, Ukraine, this is a complicated issue in some ways, but in other ways, it's very simple. Ukraine, and Brandon is an expert on this. I'm looking forward to him correcting me on some of this probably. But, Ukraine is not in the American people's self-interest. It's
Right.
just not. And, this is why I kind of brought up earlier the fact that a third of our country was acquired from beating Mexico in a war in the mid 1800s, because, the Soviet, we still, it's funny because, it was Barack Obama when he was president who made fun of Republicans for living in this world in which we still fear the Soviet Union as if nothing changed. And yet what's going on in Ukraine and our treatment of that situation is a holdover of the Cold War mentality. So, just briefly, Ukraine, it was always run by a bunch of different countries. In 1917, World War I ended. When that came to an end, that's when the Soviet Union really took hold of Ukraine. But they didn't take hold of all of it. It wasn't until World War II that they really acquired the whole nation as it exists today. And so our influence there, Ukraine is Puerto Rico. I just want to be clear with people. It's a U.S. territory. So the idea that Ukraine's an independent nation is a bunch of bull crap. It's not. So, Ukraine, if you go back to 2004, Leighton, 2004, they had an election in Ukraine, and this is what always happens. You've got a huge portion of Ukrainians who've lived under the Soviet Union for 70 or 50 years in other cases, and they feel a familiarity with Russia. And so, but the West still having this Cold War mentality, we cannot tolerate, there are other reasons too, but we cannot tolerate the idea that Ukraine could ever embrace the bosom of Putin. We want to keep them apart. So basically all of our actions are dependent upon punishing and hurting Russia and taking Ukraine for ourselves. And so 2004, there was an election, and it was a pro-Russian president that ran, basically pro-Moscow, and somebody who was pro-West. And of course, the Moscow candidate won, and they screamed there was election fraud. It was a stolen election. Sounds familiar, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the US. So, and of course, George Bush and the U.S., we backed that and said, yeah, it was stolen. And so the Supreme Court intervened, and they made them have another election, and they had the outcome they wanted. The kind of pro-Western president was elected. That was the Orange Revolution. Yeah. If you fast forward, so my point is, we intervened, right? And supported that because it was going towards Moscow. Fast forward 10 years to 2014, and in the year before, you had an election, and you had the European Union effectively trying to negotiate a deal, an agreement with Ukraine. And they were requiring them to kind of Europeanize and so on and so forth. And Moscow came in and offered them what appealed to them, what seemed to be a better deal at the time. They were in debt, they needed loans, and Moscow came to their aid. Well, the president of the country, Ukraine at the time, he pulled out of the agreement with the EU, with the West, and the U.S. directly intervened and got involved in a revolution there, the Maidan Revolution. It was a violent protest. That president had been duly elected. There were no calls of election fraud. He had been elected by the Ukrainian people, but because he gave the middle finger to the West, to the European Union, to the United States of America. Well, Victoria Nuland, our State Department, got in there, and we backed a violent protest to oust him from office. So that's important to understand when you engage in when you start to approach Ukraine, because Ukraine has not been autonomous. They're just a puppet, and they get moved whatever direction we decide.
Mm-hmm. Brandon, obviously you just wrote what's described as a searing account of this conflict. One of the things that I really appreciate about your book, something I hadn't heard before, is that you say that the seeds of the current conflict were actually sown in the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And so that was that kind of started to have this war make sense for me in a way that I hadn't understood before. The other thing I want to ask you about is that you're the I guess the outgoing president, if we can call, or the vestiges of him, Mr. Biden, is doing some very strange things on his way out of the White House. Pardoned his son. Of course, he said many times he wasn't going to do that. Did it, but he seems to be on his way out, trying to throw some gasoline on this war over there. Do you want to talk about that and the danger that poses?
Yeah. So everything Drew said is correct. In fact, just to remind audiences, Yanukovych, who was the nominally pro-Russian leader of Ukraine when the overthrow happened in 2014, he was actually in 2010 or 2011 hailed by Time magazine as the savior of Ukraine, because he was viewed as the least corrupt president in Ukraine's history. So, and I talk about that in the book too. I have a whole chapter on Yanukovych. Yanukovych was, yes, he was aligned with Russia nominally, but he actually was not a puppet of Russia. In fact, he had many falling outs with Putin on many issues, especially the attempt to align Ukraine with the EU. He was doing what every great leader of a middle power tries to do. He was trying to basically balance between two gigantic, hegemons that he was torn between. So he was negotiating with the EU at the same time he was negotiating with Russia, trying to get the best deal. And Putin offered him a better deal. And so, but anyway, that's beside the point. Yanukovych is a greatly misunderstood man, not necessarily a great man, but definitely misunderstood in that context. But to your question, what's going on with Hunter Biden, what's been going on with the Democratic Party in the United States when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, it is all about those money flows in and out of Ukraine. The Democratic Party, beginning in 1994, when Bill Clinton and Strobe Talbot negotiated the denuclearization of Ukraine, the Democratic Party became ensconced with Ukrainian politics. They were sending over pollsters. They were sending over all these people to make money in the post-Soviet Ukraine era. And so these deep connections between the Ukraine lobby and the Democratic Party in particular were forged that last to this day. And so Hunter Biden is sent. It's very interesting. This pardon was given 2014. That's when January of 2014 is how far the pardon basically protects Hunter. Yeah. Why? Well, because that's when Joe Biden, as vice president of the Obama administration, took over as the point man for the Ukraine portfolio, because Obama couldn't handle it. The big guy. And his son became one of the people on the Burisma, which was the largest Ukrainian state-owned natural gas firm. He became one of the people on the board, along with Jake Hofer Black, who was the head of the CIA's counterterrorism center, who told George W. Bush after 9/11 we were going to behead bin Laden and have flies dotting the eyes of bin Laden and his cadre. That was who was on the board with Hunter. So there is a connection here, a focal point in Burisma in 2014 between CIA covert action in Ukraine directed against Russia, the Biden syndicate and the Democrats overall, which is all corrupt, and Burisma and this sort of need for money constantly in and out of Ukraine with sort of an American backing of that. So everything that's happened when it comes to the Russia collusion stuff directed against Trump in his first term, the 51 intelligence agents who signed that letter saying anything about Hunter Biden's laptop in 2020 was supposedly a Russian disinformation operation. Of course, it wasn't. And now the pardon, all of this is connected to the very significant underhanded operations going on in Ukraine for the last 30 years. And what is the point? The point, and Drew started to touch on it, the reason 2004, the George W. Bush administration started supporting anti-Russian elements overtly in Ukraine is because in 2010, the Russia's lease on their very important Black Sea port of Sevastopol was up for renewal. And the Americans and NATO wanted to have a friendly regime in Kyiv so they could basically cancel that lease, ending Russia's naval presence on the Black Sea that went back to Catherine the Great's time. She's the one who founded that base. Colonel Potemkin, and specifically, founded that Crimean facility that has been under Russian control since Catherine the Great. This was a cockamamie attempt by the Americans and NATO to push the Russians out of Sevastopol, and it blew up in their face, because what happened was Yanukovych, the nominally pro-Russian leader, said, we're not doing that. And then he signed a lease renewal on that port. But then immediately in 2014, the Americans got the Euromaidan revolution going, overthrowing Yanukovych. What was the first move Russia made after that? They annexed Crimea, because they knew this was a cockamamie attempt by the Americans to push them out of the Sevastopol port. That is one of only 4 warm water ports that Russia possesses. The other one, interestingly, of import is Tartus in Syria, which, of course, is now under threat by U.S.-backed jihadi groups. So what I'm getting at here is there is a long-running strategy, it's covert, to not only expand NATO into the former Soviet bloc to push Russia permanently back, but it is also a cockamamie plan to push the Russians back to their medieval era borders, knowing that that will collapse the Russian state, break that country into 4 or 5 smaller countries. And the belief among the West is that at that point, $11 trillion of natural resources in Russia can be tapped into by Western multinational firms just itching to get into the Russian market.
Hence the title of your book, A Disaster of Our Own Making.
Yes.
Ours being the United States. Makes total sense.
Yes.
Now, I noticed that although Mr. Trudeau and people like Javier Milei have been invited to Mar-a-Lago, Mr. Zelensky has not received his invitation yet. And interestingly, the globalist community has treated the Israeli leader, Mr. Netanyahu, in an opposite fashion, in an inverse fashion, to their darling, Mr. Zelensky. There was this recent international court warrant that was issued, Drew, for the leader, the Israeli leader, basically declaring him a criminal. And Justin Trudeau said publicly that he would arrest him. But in America, in the United States, the Republicans basically shrugged their shoulders and said, this is a corrupt court. We're not going to take this seriously. Is this one of the other points of disagreement, do you think, between America and the incoming Trump administration and the Trudeau regime? And what do you think is going to happen in Trump 2.0 in terms of what's happening over in Gaza?
Well, firstly, as it relates to Canada and Trudeau, Trudeau is the enemy of the United States of America. That's simple. Yeah. He's as much a threat to us as Kamala Harris was and Joe Biden were. That's the reality. And so,
can I ask you a question about that? Those of us, most people, I think, see a line of distinction between, say, Xi Jinping and the Chinese people. Do you think Americans see that same line of distinction between our leader and rank and file Canadians?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think that's the case. Maybe in other countries, actually, sometimes, but I think it is clear in Canada. I mean, the view, honestly, of many Americans, of Canadians, is that they're just a very friendly people, and that's about it. I mean, I'm very serious, like very nice, very polite,
and good at hockey,
and very, very good at hockey. Yeah. But there's not really a lot of understanding about Canada or Canada's history. In many ways, you guys are just kind of like Americans that don't live here. I mean, I think that's the way a lot of people think of Canadians. Yeah. And I don't mean, that's just the reality. But I think
America's
that's also,
top hat. I get it.
Well, look, but what does Trudeau represent? I mean, what does he communicate to American people or people around the world about who the Canadian people are? He doesn't give Canadians an identity. I mean, if anything, all Canada's known for is the fact that you've got this little dictator that might be related to a former Cuban dictator, the offspring of Castro, in Cuba. I mean, that's it. But the point is, Canada is going to suffer under Trudeau's leadership as it relates to the United States of America under Donald Trump, if Trudeau continues on the present course. Because we cannot tolerate somebody who is aligned with our enemies engaging in policy and so on and so forth that directly affects it. I mean, this is, it is obvious, but worth mentioning over and over again, that Canada is connected to the United States of
Right.
America.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah.
like this is, some country that's across the ocean. I mean, this is right here. So small things affect and seep into the United States of America as well. So there has to be a keener and closer alignment. As it relates to Gaza and all of that, I think that Trump will be able to end this war. A lot of it is related to, of course, the fact that we have taken a soft stance, of course, on Israel's enemies and also our enemies in the Middle East. I mean, little things like Obama coming in and pouring billions back into Iran's economy, effectively, or giving it over to the government. When he flies planes over and here's cash, here's dollar bills. Same thing with Joe Biden when he unfroze assets. I think that we can learn something perhaps from the Reagan years. As much as I admire and love Reagan, I think in hindsight, one of the mistakes we made was that we didn't destroy Hezbollah. We allowed them to live and continue. We had an opportunity when they bombed our bases, of course, in Beirut, and we had made the decision that we weren't going to really pursue and destroy them. But here's the thing, too. That's an ideology that is hard to destroy. I mean, even if you get rid of Hezbollah, something's waiting in the wings to come back in. At the end of the day, we have to wage an ideological war in the Middle East, in my opinion, because all of these pretend games of naive people who think that you can have a two-state solution, for example, between Palestine and Israel, it's foolhardy, and it doesn't address the problems themselves. I mean, Israel is a superpower with nuclear weapons in the Middle East. They stand alone. If Israel wanted to, they could wipe many of these places off the face of the earth. Now, there would be enormous repercussions for that, but they do have that ability. Yeah. And, the root cause of the problem in the Middle East with them is anti-Semitism. It's pretty simple. Yeah. And if you can't understand that, and you want to try and conflate, Israelis' defensive actions with the hostility of radical Islamists in the region, you're a fool.
Yeah. Interestingly, anti-Semitism is on the rise in Canada. I see anti-Semitism as kind of and I see it as kind of a bellwether. Yeah. Anti-Semitism is kind of a bellwether for things really going wrong in the culture and the polity of a people. And Brandon, you've written at least one book on the topics in the Middle East. Yeah. So the shadow war. What do you think about this? How is Trump going to? How is he going to end that Gaza?
So we have to first take the kind of 30,000-foot view here and realize that these are not happening in an isolated fashion. What's happening in the Middle East is not divorced from what's happening in Europe or Asia or even Africa and Latin America. The insuperable wound that has become gangrenous on the international body politic is the Ukraine war. If you can stop the bleeding there, it will have a knock-on effect of creating stability in the Middle East, in Asia, and throughout the world. As long as that war in Ukraine is going on, the Russians will basically be fighting us everywhere. The Chinese will be backing their play. The North Koreans and the Iranians will be empowered to do whatever it is they're going to do in their parts of the world, and the Venezuelans too, by the way, as long as that war goes on. So if Trump can get a ceasefire, and I believe he will in his first 100 days with Putin over Ukraine, suddenly Russia is not as inclined to be as actively involved in the Middle East as they are. Suddenly, the Chinese and the Russians, who are like this right now, building a new world order before our very eyes, that if we're not careful in a decade, will knock the United States out as the dominant power. The Chinese and Russians, though, have natural antipathies toward each other. They are not natural allies. They are frenemies at best. If that war in Ukraine is over, the support suddenly doesn't become as tight, I don't think, as it is right now. And then, of course, Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Putin is paying Kim gobs and gobs of money to send personnel and equipment into the fray in Ukraine. But if the war is over, suddenly Kim Jong-un doesn't need Russia the way he does right now, and he's going to be looking for a new buddy, and that buddy would be Donald Trump. And so the rapprochement that was started between Trump and Kim in the first term can hopefully continue, but it won't right now as long as the Ukraine war is going on. Specifically in the Middle East, I think as peace is reigning everywhere, I believe the one regime that will be removed militarily by the U.S. and its allies will be the Iranian regime. I think at some point in the next 4
Praise
years,
God, it happens.
the mullahs will not be there anymore, and it will be because of what we are doing consciously to end that regime. Now, my concern is that we get sucked into a major ground war in Iran. I don't want that to happen. My hope is that we use the Abraham Accords, which was the alliance created by Trump between the Sunni Arabs led by the Saudis plus the Israelis. We use that alliance to sort of put Iran back into its containment, and then we exert maximum economic and diplomatic pressure on Iran until that regime simply crumbles and dies. I suspect, though, there's going to be a point at which Iran is not just going to sit and take it. You see, right now, everybody's been asking, why hasn't Iran returned fire for what's gone on with Israel? It's because, and this is not widely reported, it's because Vladimir Putin is holding Iran back. Mm-hmm. At some point, though, even Putin will not be able to hold the mad dog back. And I think if Israel does follow through on these plans to annex parts of the West Bank and Gaza at some point in the next year or two, I think inevitably Iran will go off the chain, which will then necessitate an air war from the United States and its allies that will basically decimate the regime. And I think the hope is that the people of Iran at that point will rise up and overthrow the regime. You're already seeing Netanyahu. He's never done this before. The last few months, he's been making direct appeals to the people of Iran to overthrow the regime. And I think the preferred replacement for the mullahs is found in the Shah's grandson, who's been making the rounds on all the podcasts here in the United States, on PBD podcasts. Yeah. Yes. So there's a reason he's coming out of the woodwork with his family. I think there is a desire and a design to make peace with Russia, try to contain China, but ultimately to break the back of Iranian power in the region once and for all. And if we can avoid a major ground war, that's probably for the best, but it's a risky scenario. But you just look at the people Trump surrounded himself by, they're all Iran hawks. So that's probably where things are going.
Yeah. And, I'm going to play geopolitical analyst here. Don't laugh, Brandon. So coming back to this meme, Donald Trump's own meme, where he has this lament. He goes, "Oh, Canada." And he's staring north, and when he's looking north, he's looking towards the Arctic. And who's in the Arctic? Who's threatening in the Arctic? Well, the Chinese and the Russians. Brandon has said, and sort of tying this into the whole Ukraine situation, could Trump be sending a message to the Chinese and the Russians saying, don't you dare, I'm paying attention to this northern border.
That's right.
And as a Canadian, it's frightening because if that comes to fruition, if the Chinese and the Russians take that step in the Arctic, Canada could be the next Ukraine. We could be the site of the next proxy war. What do you think about that? Is that crazy?
No. And in fact, what we've been watching, I was a few years ago, I was out at Western Air Defense Sector, which is in Tacoma, Washington. It's Joint Base McChord. And they brought me in to the intelligence group there. And the colonel there, who I don't think actually liked me very much, but the colonel there brought up the fact they were doing these intercepts of Russian nuclear bombers at increasing rates off of Alaska. And he said, I don't understand what's going on. Why? And I said, it's simple. They've reinvigorated, the Russians have, their old Soviet era bases in the Arctic Circle that are very within 300 miles in some cases of Alaskan territory. And this is part of their expansion into the Arctic. They view the Arctic as an essential part of Russia's national security strategy, and they want to dominate it, which is why they have the world's most nuclear powered icebreakers. It's why they're hot and heavy with the Chinese trying to develop the northern trade route to rival the Suez Canal. There's a whole litany of reasons what's going on up there. Canada is the front line, though, because even though Alaska is okay defended, Canada's not. You've got a lot of
Mm.
expanses of ice up there, and I'm told that the Russians are parking submarines off of the coast of northern Canada all the
This is
time,
true.
just to test and see what
Yeah.
the Canadians do.
And
the
the biggest
Canadians
threat to
don't
them
know
are
it.
polar bears, actually.
That's right. That's right. So you could be getting, now people say, but the land up there is useless. It doesn't matter. It gives them a foothold on North America.
Yeah.
That's the
Land
issue.
land is land. Now, Drew, in your book, America's Last Stand, you talk about the ideological battle that is going on in the United States that for now, MAGA seems to be winning. One of the things that maybe Americans don't realize is that all of the wokeness and the DEI and the CRT stuff that has become so heinous and so ubiquitous in the United States is even worse in Canada. In fact, Justin Trudeau is an avatar for it. What do you think about the idea that part of the reason why the United States is looking at Canada is ideologically? There's an ideological war going on too, and that they want to sort of spread these ideas of freedom and getting back to let's say the days when we all just lived together harmoniously. That's even looking back to the 1990s. Do you think there's an ideological war, and that might be part of why America is taking interest in Canada, is because we've got to clean out all this ideologically gunk too? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's accurate. I mean, there were mistakes made when we obviously went into Vietnam and so on and so forth, but the root of America's desire to root out communism ideologically in the rest of the world is important. And I've said a couple of things. Yes, I mean, it's cultural Marxism we're talking about, and it's a direct threat to Canada. It's a direct threat to the United States of America as well. It's insidious and it's very clever in many ways, and it's disguised in these different ways with different bells and whistles. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing. And revolution, of course, is the goal. I mean, that's always been the goal. They want to foment revolution, just like they did in the Soviet, just like they did in Russia. With Lenin and Stalin and so on and so forth. But anyway, I do want to say one thing that I think is critical. And, we won an important battle for the world, actually, in November here in the United States of America by reelecting Donald Trump. But here's the problem. The Democrat Party is very, very weak. And Joe Biden's not helping them at all. His pardoning of Hunter Biden, I don't really care to some extent. I actually think that's the greatest service he's done to his country since he's been in office, because he's burning down the Democrat Party and their brand on his way out. And the reality is, what we've suffered from in America, and what plenty of people do around the world, is that the Marxists, the leftists, the Democrats, whatever you want to call them, they are better marketers, right? I'm a publicist. I do PR. They've got a better PR firm. And they have created this image of themselves that's, of course, not true.
You guys are pretty good, though, Drew, I got to say.
Well, yes. Well, but Trump's come in and he's kind of revitalized the image and MAGA and so on and so forth. But at risk here, so we have a critical moment in American history here. We won this important battle in November, reelecting him, and we have an opportunity to basically eradicate the Democrat Party in perpetuity in this country, as far as I'm concerned. But it depends upon American Congress's desire and ability to actually pass his agenda, because what happens time and time again is citizens, American citizens, for example, they do not get to actually experience the fruits of the policies that we talk about, that we run on and campaign on. They don't happen. And so it leaves this opening for Democrats and the opposition to continue to assert that their policies, which are in fact responsible for our demise, just a little bit more of that's going to help us, because we've never shown the American people, hey, I mean, it's happened to some extent with Reagan and tax cuts and so on and so forth. But for example, if you eliminate the Department of Education, wow, it's only been around since 79, 80. Suddenly people aren't going to be able to read or write. I mean,
they already can't.
Yeah, they already can. It's gotten worse
because of the Department of Education.
Right.
Yeah. And so, we have to take bold steps now, for example, and totally eliminate departments like that, because only in doing so will the American people suddenly realize that it's been a ruse all along, that they've been told that they can't survive without their government. So eliminate the Department of Education, get rid of all of it. And the American people wake up a year later and be like, oh, my kid's actually not learning. He's learning how to read and write as opposed to, transgenderism and critical race theory in school. And so this is the kind of moment we have in history. But I am concerned because, our majority in Congress, in the House, because California has in fact stolen a number of House seats. I live in California
and Colorado.
Yeah.
Yep. And Colorado. We have a possibly a one seat majority. So
and the Senate Republicans are also a problem. The Senate Republicans are also a huge problem.
Yeah.
So,
but this ideological war, that I call it a war, but the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, we call it the Communist Broadcasting Corporation now in Canada, affectionately, only exists because of the fear that Canada would be overrun by Americanism, by American ideas. I don't think that Canada can defend itself against American quote unquote propaganda, especially the good kind. Quoting Edward Bernays, that might be the greatest threat to the people who do want to keep America out of Canada, is that really MAGA is an irresistible force of propaganda given the information streams that are available. And this is a big part of the reason why Trudeau is trying to shut down all these avenues of social media to suppress freedom of speech. But I think MAGA is an irresistible force. What do you think?
With good reason. I mean, what is MAGA saying? We want people, ordinary people, to have a real chance at a good life. We want all people to be respected for who they are, and we want prosperity and peace. What's not to like about? And we want freedom. Real freedom. And I think you're right, because I think if you remember the great trucker protest, what was it, in 2021, that was entirely born out of responses from the Canadian people to encouragement that they were seeing from the rise of MAGA in the United States. In fact, there are many people I know who were activists for MAGA who were helping the truckers out wherever they could.
I understand the idea actually came from the United States.
Came from the U.S. Came from MAGA, because Canada is, whether certain people in Canada like it or not, Canada is a natural extension of the United States. Sure. And I think, honestly, and I said this recently to somebody at DOD, and they looked at me like I was crazy. I'm sure they put something in a file somewhere on me because of it. I actually think Trudeau has never actually won a real election in his life. I think every Canadian election he's won has been rigged, because I have yet. Now, I live in Southwest Florida. A lot of my neighbors are from Ontario. They're part-timers. They're snowbirds, have these nice houses here. They're wonderful people. I have yet to meet a single Canadian. And by the way, also at that base I was talking about, there's a large Canadian contingent because it's a NORAD base. And the Canadian contingent commander who was retiring had very choice words to say to me off the record about Trudeau. I have yet to meet a single Canadian who likes Trudeau. I haven't met one. And I know
we need to get Dinesh D'Souza to do his next documentary.
That's right. And so I think that you probably have rigged elections, because how else is this guy who, and I know, I'm not kidding, I know an insane amount of Canadians. How is it that this guy I've never heard one positive thing about keeps winning these elections? Can somebody in Canada tell me? Because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't.
It doesn't. And of course,
and he's so anti-Canada.
Yes, he is. He is, and it is destroying, and much to the lament of people who. Canadians love their country too. They also love America. Right. There's no hatred. There's no rational Canadian person who hates America. So really, what we're talking about here is restoring the natural state of being in terms of the relationship between Canada and the United States. But, the interesting thing is I've never known a time in Canada when more people wanted to be a part of the United States. And I think that's due to a combination of factors that we've talked about. The situation in Canada is very dire. There's been a lot of destruction of our nationhood, much as has happened in the U.S., but also it's this force of MAGA. MAGA is a really it's an incredibly seductive idea. I shouldn't call it an idea. I would say it's even a philosophy. It's the only antidote that I've seen thus far that has the potential to stand up to globalism and actually defeat it.
Agreed.
And I think it's already started to do it.
Agreed.
Anyway, guys, we're over an hour now. I know you're incredibly
Yeah.
busy, so I want to just give each of you a chance to give your last word. Tell the viewers and listeners where they can find you, and talk about your last books and your next books. I understand that Brandon's got a project he's going to write about the Arctic. That should be interesting. But yeah, tell us. Go ahead, guys. Give us the last word.
Go ahead, Drew. You go ahead.
Well, sure. I mean, the best place to keep up with me is to subscribe to my Substack, drewallen.substack.com. From there, everything flows. And I'm almost done with a book, Brandon. It's actually, I was trying to write an entirely apolitical book about my experience living and working in Italy and all my lifetime of experience there. I speak Italian and so on and so forth. And it was like a fantasy, the Italian spell, about how I keep getting drawn back. I met my wife there and so on and so forth. But I'm almost done, Brandon, and it's about politics, about socialism, and about my observations of what it did to the country. So I guess I'm just a political animal.
I'm sure
I
it's
couldn't
going
help
to be.
myself.
I'm sure
It's a love
going to be just
story.
wonderful.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, your original
Send me a
book.
copy. I'll give you a blurb.
Wow, and bravo for writing a book while your wife is about to have a baby. But yeah, your last book was wonderful. I'm sure the next one will be just as good or better. Brandon, what about you? What's your final thoughts?
Yeah. So you can follow me at We the Brandon on Twitter X. I'm also on Getter and True Social under that same handle. I am primarily now writing over at the National Interest as a national security analyst. I do 4 articles a day on various technology, military technology, geopolitical. Yeah, I guess so. And no AI is used, because people have said, how are you doing it without AI? No AI. It's all coming from here. I got a lot to say. So that's where I am normally. I also have the Weichert Report. I don't know if I should announce it yet, but I'm joining Popular Mechanics as well.
Wow.
And yeah.
You ever end?
No. I got to keep the money going. I got 3 kids.
That's right.
And I'm also a consultant for the Defense Department. And I'm trying to think if there's anywhere else. My books, Amazon usually is the best place to find them, but they're at your local bookstores too. And that project you mentioned, I'm looking at 1 of 3 for my next project. The Arctic one is becoming more appealing, especially now after what we talked about. I keep telling people the joke, the Arctic book is coming along. It's just proceeding at a glacial pace. So
I got a working title for you, Brandon. Consider it Maple MAGA.
What is it?
Listen, our flag's already red, so I mean, it's a natural. But no, seriously, folks, I want to thank our guests, Drew Allen and Brandon Weichert, for being here. 2 big brain guys, American guys who have obviously thought a lot about Canada, and Canada's, I guess, growing importance geopolitically, not in a good way. Hopefully that improves. But I hope that everybody has really enjoyed this live stream. I love doing these. I love talking to these smart guys, and I learn every time I get a chance to talk with them. And I hope that you've had that same experience. I want to finish off just by wishing all of you happy Christmas, a wonderful time with your families. Enjoy the season. And thanks so much for being with us today on the Gray Matter live stream.
Blame Canada.